Welcome to Book Rising, a podcast by the Radical Books Collective.
Welcome to the very first episode of Book Rising from the Radical Books Collective. My name is Meg Arenberg, and in this first episode, I interview Yvonne Adhiambo Owuor, award-winning author from Kenya, who joins me from Berlin to chat about the recent announcement of Abdulrazak Gurnah as 2021 winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature. Yvonne shares her admiration for Gurnah's work as both novelist and mentor, and the places where her own novels have been most influenced by his, particularly her most recent, The Dragonfly Sea, which, like so much of Abdulrazak Gurnah's writing, depicts the cultural worlds of East Africa's Swahili coast from the perspective of the waters which connect it with the world. We end the episode with a short passage from Gurnah's 2001 novel, By the Sea. Hi, Yvonne. Thank you so much for making the time to chat with me.
Hello, Meg.
And I should say congratulations. I've been congratulating East Africans for 2 days straight. It's such an exciting moment.
I'll bask in that particular glory.
Well, I saw that you wrote on Twitter that this was a family win. And I just love that, and I thought I would ask, if that's the family of East African writers, or are you speaking of something more specific? Who's the family here?
No, well, it's East African, but it's also those who know or who have met Professor Gurnah and who have loved his work and the man for such a long time. It feels like, that favorite uncle that's rather shy and unknown, but then suddenly he's discovered. And you feel this extra pride in his being found. And you delight in the fact that so many others will now discover his lyricism and his beauty and his capacity to explore our woundedness, human woundedness in such beautiful and tender ways.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's just an overwhelming joy to share this moment. And I know you lived in Zanzibar yourself, and I've heard you talk about what a hugely important experience that was for you and your work. And I wondered if that's when you first read Gurnah's books, or you say you've met him yourself. I mean, is maybe I should ask if Gurnah's Zanzibar is recognizable to you as your Zanzibar.
In every single in so many ways, and his work was such an inspiration. I found his work actually just before I left for Zanzibar. The owner of Bookstop, Chan, in Nairobi, is the one who introduced me to Abdulrazak Gurnah's work, and I bought it was Paradise, Admiring Silence, and By the Sea, all at once, and then went to Zanzibar, and in many ways he was a kind of spiritual guide, or a literary guide to the place, and it's especially its silences and ghosts, which I was very conscious of. Mm. And then later on, in a kind of twist of fate, when I was shortlisted for the Caine Prize, he was on the jury that gave me the award. So, and he was one of those who, in many ways, anointed my literary journey, in that he had, in his very gentle, almost very self-effacing and shy way, said, "You must write." Kind of saying you have a gift, you must keep writing, and you must not doubt yourself. So it's very tender and very kind and very courtly. So he has a very special place in my heart.
I've not met him myself, but I have heard that from so many of his former students and colleagues, that same sort of sense of quiet encouragement and just a beautiful human being, as well as such a lyricist.
Oh, beautiful. Oh, as you can see, that's why I guess most hearts are just kind of extra rejoicing and so happy for him.
Yeah. I've also seen sort of a number of references to ocean literature, or, he's often, so much of his work is, of course, themed around, relations within and across the Indian Ocean. And I wonder if you could speak a little to, what ocean literature might be, or maybe you would term it sea literature. But if that has meaning for you.
Absolutely, it absolutely does. And I although it may not be, it's not overt, I now strongly believe that his way of, if you want, painting, cartography of space and place, of the African space that encompasses and embraces the oceans, is also something that I have adopted. Without making too much noise about it, including and exploring the East African maritime imagination, and using that to speak of deep and profound interconnections and tentacles into the world, century-old interconnections and tentacles into the world, and looking at the world from the place of the waters rather than from land, but also the implications of that, the complexities linked to that kind of way of seeing and being. I'm sure Meg, I suspect part of the difficulty that I think especially and I'm not being mean about the Americans, maybe have had initial trouble about receiving his work is he offers an African cosmopolitanism that does not conform with this rather petty and small imagination of an African history that supposedly begins only when the Europeans arrive, and his work is such an incredible, quiet but very deep stake and reference to that and to an older African history. That's one way. But the other thing is that what I particularly love is his, and that also informs my own quest, is the way in which, even in his work, there's a sort of continuity to Swahili literary history, with the modes and the tropes he uses. And there's just and he does that even when he's writing in English. So well, I could go on and on. I'm a fan, as you can see.
I would love to hear you speak more about those. How what might we put it, those palimpsests or those literary relations across language and also across genre or literary form. Is there anything in particular, any particular part of the Swahili literary tradition that you hear in his work in particular? Like, could you give us a little more specifics there?
I don't have any of his books here with me. I would have to refer to some of the, in By the Sea, for example, that conversation between the asylum seeker and the two kind of protagonists. The conversation they have is a very Swahili kind of conversation. The relationship, negotiations. It's something that's so recognizable in the landscape from which both come from. So what can one say? So the memories of Saleh Omar, for example, and Latif's accusations. Coming from East Africa, I wonder if another person from a different place would recognize it. But when you pick up the book as an East African and as one who's familiar with the Swahili coast, they're recognizable and they're people if that makes any sense.
Yes, of course, yeah.
Yes.
Well, maybe I'll go back to another thing that you just mentioned in response to that earlier question, which is about cartographies, of course. And there's a quotation which I think is also from By the Sea that I've seen circulating quite a bit in the last couple of days. That starts, I speak to maps, and sometimes they speak something back to me.
Yes.
And before maps, the world was limitless. They made places on the edges of the imagination seem graspable and placeable. And I think for me that that quote really speaks particularly to your work. And I'm thinking of the Dragonfly Sea in particular. There's so many maps and map-loving characters, and not only speaking to maps, but I think also speaking maps into being. And so I would love to hear you talk a little more about cartography.
I love that line, speaking maps into being. That is such a gorgeous, beautiful, beautiful quote, isn't it? But I wonder, and it's completely relatable. And yes, right from childhood, I've loved maps. I've loved atlases. Only probably because I don't have I don't have a very good sense of direction. I need to be honest. I've got a pathetic sense of direction. So the idea of charted territories is both magical, mysterious, and fascinating to me. I don't know what more I can say. I suspect those of us who are ocean haunted and ocean loving, necessarily because of the seeming vastness, try to create lines of passage in our imaginations, and the closest approximations are, of course, the physical map, that don't necessarily conform to the maps of our own imagination. But I guess the cartographies are absolutely, certainly for me. I think for me, maps are also literature. But our professor, of course, is an absolute specialist and veteran in this. His books are like maps, aren't they? They're journey stories, and they point to such incredible, to use your word, the cartographies, and they're very layered, and the cartographies are very layered. They are of space, of memory, of place, of story. And that's something Professor Gurnah does so gently and yet so beautifully.
Yes. And I wonder, too, if that's part of that sort of ineffable Swahili-ness that you that you identify in his work. I mean, I'm thinking also of what you've written in the past about the late Haji Gora Haji.
Haji Gora Haji. Ah, yes, oh my beloved old man.
The incredible, of course, Swahili poet, also from Zanzibar, from the island of Tumbatu. And
yes. Meg, I think you're onto something. I think it's not something that of course you're thinking, one should have been aware of this, but yes, you're right. There's a cartographic sensibility embedded not within the language and among the culture of the peoples. But it would make sense. They were a trading nation, and they traded with the whole world, and they traversed the seas. And in many ways, they mapped the seas. Families mapped the seas. Families had ways of storying, of naming and languaging the seas, so that they could write their way or tell their way or story their way from any one of the ports to another destination, just in recitations that show up in forms of poetry, different forms of poetry. So
beautiful.
What a lovely idea. I think I'll explore it further. But yes, there is definitely a cartographic sensibility embedded in the language and embedded in the culture.
And I think, that is perhaps also what makes it so difficult, as you say, for so many American readers. I think you're exactly right that this prize win in particular just places a glaring light on our provinciality. But even that notion of an Africa that is so outward looking, but not at the West, right? I mean, that there's a gaze in another direction, and that they're just, maybe the West is irrelevant in this gaze, in this cartographic sensibility.
Well, it's an old cartographic sensibility, and at that time the West did not exist, of course, and nor was it a major player in the waters of the region. So it was neither there. It was not even there was no imagination of a significant West. that then later shows up with violence, with I think and the kind of bewildered violence that our Professor Gurnah constantly asks, even especially when he refers to the revolution. But it's also a question that I think he kind of alludes to when he speaks about the colonial project. Why was such cruelty necessary? And it's a very good question. But yeah, back to what you said. Quite frankly, the African cosmopolitanisms, the East African cosmopolitanisms, the global monsoon complex did not feature the West because the West was not a factor. But it did. It was an incredible global project that lasted for a very, very, very long time.
Yvonne, thank you so much. I've so enjoyed this conversation.
You're so welcome, Meg. Thank you so much. I've just seen your name. It's lovely that we meet and talk over somebody that I think we both care about. You sound like you absolutely know of his work and know his work.
I do, and I feel the attention to the region on the whole, to Zanzibar and to Swahili as a language and as a literary tradition, which I agree with you. I think lives in his work in some way. I'm basking in it myself, sort of undeservedly.
No, all of us. We are all deserved, I think. All of us, we're kind of basking because we know he wouldn't mind. It's the nature of his heart.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, and I hope we'll have another chance to talk sometime in the future.
I hope so too. Okay. Be well.
You too. And here for the final words on the matter and a taste of his artistry is a passage from Abdulrazak Gurnah's By the Sea. Oud al-Qamari. Its fragrance comes back to me at odd times, unexpectedly, like a fragment of a voice or the memory of my beloved's arm on my neck. Every Eid I used to prepare an incense burner and walk around my house with it, waving clouds of perfume into its deepest corners, pacing the labors it had taken me to possess such beautiful things, rejoicing in the pleasure they brought to me and to my loved ones. Incense burner in one hand and a brass dish filled with oud in the other. Aloe wood, Oud al-Qamari, the wood of the moon. That was what I thought the words meant. But the man I obtained my consignment from explained that the translation was really a corruption of Khmer, Cambodia, because that was one of the few places in the world where the right kind of aloe wood was to be found. The oud was a resin which only an aloe tree infected by fungus produced. A healthy aloe tree was useless, but the infected one produced this beautiful fragrance. Another little irony by you-know-who. The man I obtained the Oud al-Qamari from was a Persian trader from Bahrain who had come to our part of the world with the musim, the winds of the monsoons. He and thousands of other traders from Arabia, the Gulf, India, and Sind, and the Horn of Africa. They had been doing this every year for at least 1,000 years. In the last months of the year, the winds blow steadily across the Indian Ocean towards the coast of Africa, where the currents obligingly provide a channel to harbor. Then, in the early months of the new year, the winds turn around and blow in the opposite direction, ready to speed the traders home. It was all as if intended to be exactly thus, that the winds and currents would only reach the stretch of coast from southern Somalia to Sofala, at the northern end of what has become known as the Mozambique Channel. South of this stretch, the currents turned evil and cold, and ships that strayed beyond there were never heard of again. South of Sofala was an impenetrable sea of strange mists and whirlpools a mile wide, and giant luminescent stingrays rising to the surface in the dead of night, and monstrous squids obscuring the horizon. For centuries, intrepid traders and sailors, most of them barbarous and poor no doubt, made the annual journey to that stretch of coast on the eastern side of the continent which had cusped so long ago to receive the musim winds. They brought with them their goods and their God and their way of looking at the world, their stories and their songs and prayers, and just a glimpse of the learning which was the jewel of their endeavors. And they brought their hungers and their greeds, their fantasies and lies and hatreds, leaving some among their number behind for whole lifetimes and taking what they could buy, trade, or snatch away with them, including people they bought, or kidnapped and sold into labor and degradation in their own lands. After all that time, the people who lived on that coast hardly knew who they were, but knew enough to cling to what made them different from those they despised, among themselves as well as among the outlying progeny of the human race in the interior of the continent. Then the Portuguese, rounding the continent, burst so unexpectedly and so disastrously from that unknown and impenetrable sea, and put paid to medieval geography with their sea-borne cannons. They wreaked their religion-crazed havoc on islands, harbors, and cities, exulting over their cruelty to the inhabitants they plundered. Then the Omanis came to remove them and take charge in the name of the true God, and brought with them Indian money, with the British close behind, and close behind them the Germans and the French and whoever else had the wherewithal. New maps were made, complete maps, so that every inch was accounted for, and everyone now knew who they were, or at least who they belonged to. Those maps, how they transformed everything. And so it came to pass that in time those scattered little towns by the sea along the African coast found themselves part of huge territories stretching for hundreds of miles into the interior, teeming with people they had thought beneath them, and who, when the time came, promptly returned the favor. Among the many deprivations inflicted on those towns by the sea was the prohibition of the Muslim trade. The last months of the year would no longer see crowds of sailing ships lying plank to plank in the harbor, the sea between them glistening with slicks of their waste, or the streets thronged with Somalis, or Suri Arabs, or Sintis, buying and selling and breaking into incomprehensible fights, and at night camping in the open spaces, singing cheerful songs and brewing tea, or stretched out on the ground in their grimy rags, shouting raucous ribaldries at each other. In the last year or two after that, the streets and the open spaces were silent with their absences in those late months of the year, especially when we felt the lack of the things they used to bring with them, ghee and gum, cloths, and crudely hammered trinkets, livestock and salted fish, dates, tobacco, perfume, rosewater, incense, and handfuls of all manner of wondrous things. We missed the ill-kempt gaiety they filled the town with. But soon we mostly forgot them, as they became unimaginable to the new lives we led in those early years after independence. In any case, perhaps they would not have gone on coming for much longer. Who would choose to come hundreds of miles across the sea to sell us cloth and tobacco when they could live a life of luxury in the rich states of the Gulf? Thank you for joining us at Book Rising, the Radical Books Collective podcast. We will continue to celebrate East Africa in our coming episodes, so please stay tuned for more progressive conversations about books, publishing, and writing.